Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans. Yes. Welcome back to another episode of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. I'm on half the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, Machel St. Patrick Hewitt. And with me as ever is my partner in crime, Santokie Nagulendran. Santokie, how you doing?
Yes, Mash. We're 7 days into the new year, 2024, and we've already had to drop episode 4 of West Indies Cricket, the Netflix drama. Now, no sooner had Machel put his wish list for 2024, we're out here looking at the latest drama going on within Cricket West Indies. And I think, Mash, this is an interesting one because a lot of our previous Netflix dramas or episodes about the latest ongoings of West Indies cricket are about the players and kind of what's happening there. Whereas this episode is looking at Cricket West Indies and the organisational changes they announced on the 3rd of January that they are making. And in some ways, this is more important, you would say, because this is kind of behind the scenes. This is how the organisation runs and is more of a long-term sort of strategic move that they've decided to make. So the press release, I'm just going to get into it straight away, Mash. So It came on the 3rd of January. Cricket West Indies has confirmed several organisational changes at the start of a significant year that will see the launch of a new 4-year strategic plan, 2024 to 2027, and the hosting of the ICC Men's T20 World Cup in June. So part of these organisational, Machel, just to sort of summarise, 6 members of staff by my account have had their contracts expired or moved on from the organisation. So just listing it there, we've got the Commercial Marketing and Communications Director, Dominic Warren, Philip Spooner, the Media and Public Relations Manager, Chris Brabazon, who's someone who's come on the pod, Mash. You had a really good conversation with him during the lockdown, the sort of coaching education person. It's important to stress with him as well. It's not a contractual situation. He's got a job back in his homeland of Australia, so it's slightly different. And most importantly, probably what we're going to focus on most in this episode, Machel, 3 selectors have had their contracts expired, not renewed, so they will no longer be working for Cricket West Indies as selectors. Those 3 selectors are Roland Butcher, who was serving as the senior men's assistant selector, Travis Dowling, who was working on the women's selection panel, and Robert Haynes, who was the under-19 talent ID manager / selector. So a lot of big changes there, Mash. Firstly, analysing this as an overall move, how do you sort of view this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. And I think the first thing that kind of came to mind when I read it was, whoa, that's a lot of changes, right? But then, and this what I'm about to say hasn't been confirmed by Cricket West Indies. And to be fair, we haven't reached out to the relevant stakeholders in Cricket West Indies to get confirmation on my theory here. But I wonder if this is just part and parcel of what happens in a lot of businesses. Key performance indicators, you have an appraisal, you have a contract, and if it's deemed that, you know what, we're going to move on, then your contract is effectively terminated and you move on. That's what tends to happen in the private sector, right? And we just had in recent months the announcement as the renewals of players' contracts, which we knew were coming in October. It was announced like a few weeks after what we thought was the deadline to announce them. So I just wonder if the kind of, in keeping with the players' contracts and the central contracts, there was also a kind of strategic general kind, so what am I trying to say here? A strategic general overhaul and review of all aspects of Cricket West Indies. And coming out of that is the announcement at the turn of the year. Well, you know what? There's some structural changes about to undergo. There's some personal changes that are about to be undergone. Sorry. And to be fair, Santokie, I wonder if the people involved were all informed of this a few months ago, and it's just that they've put this press release out now at the start of 2024. And then the final thing I would just say is when we met Kishore. And for anybody who's listening to this episode who hasn't as yet listened to our 100-day interview with Kishore Shallow, which happened this summer, which is probably the most professional podcast episode we'd ever done, face-to-face, filmed, etc. To be fair, Santokie, my takeaway after doing that episode with Kishore was that this is a single-minded individual, and this is an individual who wants to professionalize the way Cricket West Indies is run, bring it up to speed with how it should be run in the modern era. And again, kind of, if you look at how he's performed as president, and we try to be objective about it, I think this is in keeping with his kind of mantra, mindset, which is that we have to be better in all facets of the operational structures of Cricket West Indies. And that's not to say that any of the people who have been let go aren't good enough or anything like that, but I think it speaks to ruthless decision making with a kind of focus on, we believe that this is the way to better Cricket West Indies. Now, that's nothing that's come to us. I don't want anyone to take away from that. Oh, have you been told something? No, that's just my take and response to Santokie's questioning.
Yeah, and I think that's a great analysis and sort of summary of the situation. I think particularly in sports administration, we do see when a new president comes in, we do see these sort of changes because they want to make their mark. But as you said, Mash, we didn't get any secret information or exclusives, but just sort of the vibe we got and sort of talking to Dr. Shallow in June, we just got the impression, obviously, I don't know if corporate's the right word, just to kind of increase in making Cricket West Indies a more sort of corporate and efficient place in terms of the administration. And we've seen these changes in December come. And also, I guess it's similar to what you see with a lot of teams in terms of when we look at cricket, we talk about cycles and bringing in new players. This is almost similar, mirrors that. They're talking about the new strategic cycle. The World Cup is massive for Cricket West Indies. So it's almost as if they're trying to freshen things up for this new 4-year period. So, Mash, we're going to just kind of break down sort of the changes. Should we start with the selectors? Because I guess that's probably the most importantly linked to how the team performs in terms of selectors. So I guess firstly, it's only right. The headline will be Roland Butcher, obviously former England batter. He was in the job for a year, just December 2022, he was appointed. December 2023, he's out of the job. If I'm honest, if I'm completely honest, Mash, I wouldn't be able to tell you what sort of... I'm sure, obviously, he has input. There's only 2 selectors along with the head coach, so he must have had input. But in terms of what we saw as fans and members of the media, he wasn't very vocal, Mash, so it's hard to sort of know what his impact was and sort of what his kind of effect was as a selector for the senior men's team.
Yeah, it's a tough one because even if you go back, the selectors or the key selectors prior to Roland would have been Roger Harper and Miles Bascombe. Now, Miles Bascombe, of course, is now director of cricket within Cricket West Indies, right? But I think back to Roger Harper's stint, and when there was a press conference, Roger Harper was the main person who spoke. So it's hard in one sense to say, so what was Roland Butcher doing? Because I know that Miles Bascombe was very involved in kind of the selection processes with Roger Harper. So you have to assume that Roland Butcher was very involved vis-a-vis Desmond Haynes and selection. It's just that Desmond Haynes would be the one fronting up. What I would say, though, is as follows. And this isn't like any personal slight on Roland Butcher. This is what I would say with anybody in a job. If I'm appointed to a job and 1 year later I'm told to jog on, I ain't done a good job. It's as simple as that. And that's not personal. That's nothing personal that I've got against Roland Butcher. That's what it's saying to the public. If you've been given a year, because Desmond Haynes ain't going anywhere, whether that's because they can't buy out his contract or whatever, the point is it speaks to me of whatever the press release says it speaks to, we want to look in another direction. If he had been doing a job that was deemed good, they wouldn't have let him go. And certainly, Santokie, they wouldn't be letting him go before a World Cup year if they were deeming him to be doing a good enough job, right? And it's worth pointing out, if I just read part of the press conference, we should also just point this part out. One of the components being assessed as part of the new cricket strategy is a selection system. Cricket West Indies will further explore the strengthening of this area, building on the established policy from the 2019 selection review. Miles Bascombe, Director of Cricket at CWI, emphasised the importance of this review, stating, "We are dedicated to refining our selection processes to better serve the needs of West Indies cricket. The ongoing evaluation and restructuring efforts are integral steps towards achieving this goal." Bascombe elaborated that the review has resulted in some immediate changes in structure and personnel. The review is being planned to coincide with the end of the contracts of some selectors to enable a seamless transition. So we're going to speak about the other people that have been moved on. But again, to me, Santokie, that's a lot of words used in that press release to basically say to me how we currently use selection and how our processes currently operate is not fit for purpose. As a result, couple you man need to be jogged on. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I think, as you said, Mash, as you rightly put, if you're in any line of work and you have and your contract doesn't get renewed after 1 year in a job, it's basically the clearest signal that you haven't been meeting your targets or you haven't been performing well in the job. So I guess they'll move on from Roland Butcher. It'd be interesting to see if they change sort of the composition of selection panels going forward, how they'll sort of do it, because it did seem strange to have Desmond Haynes and Roland Butcher. I think Desmond Haynes is 67 and Roland Butcher is 70 years old. It does seem like, obviously, age can't count against anyone, but when you're picking like modern T20 squads, and we've seen, I'm not sure if that's possibly the most dynamic combination. So we could see it break up into white ball selection panels, test selection panels, because don't get me wrong, I'm sure Desmond Haynes and Roland Butcher, as former players at the highest level, they still have the eye for cricket, but maybe it's more suited towards test cricket. I just think maybe they could do a format selection panel. So have a different selection panel for 50 overs and T20 and different one for test cricket. So it'd be interesting to see how they go along those ones. Obviously, the big question, Mash, is have you got your application ready, for that selector vacancy?
Listen. I'm not even joking, As soon as I see that advert come up on LinkedIn about about we're looking for we're ready to accept applications for a vacancy in West Indies selection, on God Santokie, I'm filling in the application form. On God, I'm filling it in.
Listen, if you become selector, and I ever hear you in a press conference saying, listen, well, I owe Bandon King a phone call, I'm gonna have to cuss you out, So yeah, as we said, Roland Butcher moved on. They were on a local radio show in Barbados, the Mason and Guest show. It was suggested that it did come as a surprise to him. He got the letter informing him that his contract wasn't to be renewed on the 12th of December. So not a few weeks before his contract was up. And apparently it was a surprise. So again, that indicates a lot in terms of his reaction, what he might have been expecting. Now, the next one, Mash, Travis Dowling, who was assistant selector for the senior and youth team in the women's game, his contract has also not been renewed. Sort of, in terms of the women's team, we haven't really heard much from them in the past few months since that A-team tour to Pakistan, not from the head coach or in terms of communication and everything that. So this is a bit harder to gauge, but what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that one's I'm with you, So the actual lead selector in women's cricket is Anne Brown-John. Yeah. So she is the actual lead selector. So when I saw Travis had been moved on, that made me think, because again, I guess part of it, Santokie, is what are the contracts for the lead selectors? So there's some discrepancy coming out of Caribbean media at the moment. No one really knows when Desmond Haynes, for example, his contract is up. I thought it was June. Some people are saying September. Some are saying March. No one really knows, right? Similarly, we don't know when Anne Brown-John's contract is up. So is it a case of, in an ideal world, Cricket West Indies want to overhaul everything, but you also have to bear in mind when people's contracts are running out? Because if you get rid of it's like, okay, so Santokie, let's use football as an example, right? How rare is it that you'd get rid of an assistant manager but keep the manager in post? Like do you know what I mean? So I wonder if part of this is all about the kind of practicalities of how deep an overhaul you can do. So does it make sense that you just leave the lead selector in place, but a wider overhaul is coming? Because I can't really explain the women's one otherwise, unless it's speaking to a wider structural overhaul that's coming later.
Yeah, this is the thing, Mash. This is what I was initially confused about. All right, so let's take both panels, Anne Brown-Johnson and Travis Dowling, and you've got Desmond Haynes and Roland Butcher. If they're picking the squads, if you're Roland Butcher and Desmond Haynes, you're picking the squads together. You're collaborating, obviously, with the head coach's input as well. But you two fundamentally are the guys putting together the squads. If you're saying Roland Butcher's not good, not doing well in the job, surely this is a reflection of Desmond Haynes' performance in the job. Surely the two go hand in hand because they're meant to work in sync. It's not as if Roland Butcher's picking half the squad and Desmond Haynes is picking the other half. They're not separate entities. They're working together. So, as you said, Mash, is this just a case of it's inevitable that we'll see the lead selectors be moved on within the next few months, and it's just their contracts because they're lead selectors, they might have had longer contracts, because otherwise it just seems a bit strange that you're taking away the assistants but not taking away the sort of lead selectors, and what this sort of reflects. And yeah, so it's a bit of a confusing one. And the final selector is slightly different. Robert Haynes, he was the under-19s selector for the men's or boys game. His role was more of a talent ID manager. I think it's officially classed as. But again, man, similar to the Travis Dowling one, it's hard to know with that one, because with under 19s, your selection where you're looking at players is not, it's not as if you're looking at formal competitions, regional games. You're sort of more looking at school level competitions and sort of youth tournaments. So again, it's hard to know sort of the metric. We don't know what talent is available at a junior level, so we can't say, oh, he's not picked the best talent or what is going on. So with Robert Haynes, I think it's it's an unusual metric compared to the other selectors, and it's hard for us to sort of gauge where it could have gone wrong or why he's been moved on.
Yeah, and do you know what? So I think the other thing to bear in mind, so with the under-19s, then I mean the big assignment is like literally in 2 weeks, right? There's an under-19 World Cup. So again, if you're doing an overhaul, maybe they've looked at it and been like, well, there's no other under-19 engagement coming up. The engagement is now. The head coach for the under-19s has the players already. So if we're doing what do I want to say, a corporation-wide overhaul within one department, your role's no longer needed for this overhaul because the under-19 World Cup is now. Going back to the points we were making about Butcher and Dowling, again, I think you could maybe put the same point in for the men's and the women's, right? Because Des is there for the men's. What I think might happen, Santokie, is it suggests to me that the head coaches are taking more of a responsibility with regards to selection as well. So for the men's, you'd expect that Andre Coley, because ultimately Andre Coley works very closely with, or has worked very closely with academy, A teams, etc. So you would expect him to have a significant say in selection for the test side. Darren Sammy, obviously white ball revival, you'd expect him to have a significant say in because Dre Russ got back into the team. That surely wasn't down to Desi. That was down to Darren Sammy, right? So you'd assume that Sammy has a big say in the makeup of the white ball side. Similarly, in the women's, they have an upcoming series, I think, in Pakistan. Because our talent pool in women's cricket isn't so huge, you would assume that, remember, we've got a new head coach in Shane Dietz. I never know how to say his surname. So him as an Australian who's coming as a new head coach, maybe he wants his imprint on it. And it's him working alongside Anne Brown-John as the head selector. So it suggests to me it's a piecemeal approach to get to the final conclusion. And they're going to just kind of give a bit more responsibilities to head coaches as they work their way to almost like the inevitable, which is an overhaul of the system and approaches in general.
Yeah, I think next year we'll see the overhaul. They might just be, because the press release made such an emphasis on the T20 World Cup, and financially it is so important for Cricket West Indies, they might just be waiting for that World Cup to take place, have everything done with that, and then finally implement a full sort of restructure based on the reviews that they conducted this year. So expect this time next year, Mash, probably the selection panels and sort of the makeup of the administration in terms of how they deal with selection could be completely different after a sort of a restructure. So we wait to see how that goes. And we talked briefly, Mash, on Chris Brabazon. Obviously, he left the organization to take up a role back in Australia. He was sort of the coaching educator, I think would have been his sort of how his job would be surmised. You done an interview with him a few years ago. How would you what sort of legacy or impact would you say Brabazon's had on West Indies and the development of coaches in the region? Oh, you're on mute, Mash.
My apologies. What I would say is when I spoke to Jimmy Adams, Jimmy was very, very complimentary about Chris and the role that Chris has had. People have to remember as well that when Chris first started to have an impact in kind of coach development, it was during lockdown. So a lot of it was online. It took about, because Chris's contract wasn't even supposed to go this long. He was supposed to go back to Australia about 2 years ago. But I think one of the things that made him stay on, or they convinced him to stay on, was because he hadn't had the impact he ideally would have had. He wanted to be traveling around the different islands, doing workshops, upskilling, and there's only so much you can do online. as we all found out during the pandemic. Only so much there's only so much realness you can have with online learning, right? So it almost felt like when the pandemic ended or restrictions ended, it felt like his job was starting again. And I feel like the last 2 years or year and a half, he's actually worked what his original contract was supposed to be, in so much as go around the islands, do this camp, do that camp. And ultimately, the proof is in the stats. Over 1,000 newly certified coaches in the region. And you have to say that that's due to the structures that he has put in place. Far more people are upskilled. And one of the many things that we've always said in West Indies cricket is, you can't just expect improvement at the top level if there's no real improvement going on in the grassroots level. So I think he can leave with his head held high. The question mark for me now is who's going to continue the work. I think that's the bigger issue than Chris deciding to go home and take up a new opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's very telling, because it's such an important role, and probably not a role greatly appreciated, because it is sort of behind the scenes. It's not in the limelight, but sort of developing the coaches in the region. It'd be interesting to see if they go with someone based in who's from the region, or if again they hire someone from overseas. So we'll wait to see that appointment. I think they put out the job advert already, so that appointment should be announced soon. And Mash, the final two members of staff leaving after their contracts were not renewed. We have Dominic Warren, the Commercial Marketing and Communications Director, and Philip Spooner, the Media and Public Relations Manager. Now, it's important to emphasize in the press release, it did say, whilst both will be leaving their respective roles, they will continue to support Cricket West Indies by working directly on the ICC Men's World Cup in June. Particularly, Mash, I think Philip Spooner's probably been in the organisation for many years. I know he was a journalist for The Nation before, but I can't tell you exactly how many years, but he's been someone who's been a long-standing part of Cricket West Indies. It's also important to know, we don't know people's personal circumstances, whether they'd chosen to leave or whether it was sort of agreed by Cricket West Indies not to renew the contracts. But sort of in terms of Spooner and Warren, two people who had been at the organisation for quite a period in terms of the marketing and communications.
Yeah, and we've had personal dealings with both in different capacities. I think I can't remember when Spoons first started at Cricket West Indies. I want to say at least 7 years. It's probably more than that though, right? Dominic Warren first got the job in 2017, so he's definitely been there a while as well. And I think it's important what you just said there, Santokie. We don't know how much of it is also down to them saying, well, you know what, actually, it's time for me to explore new opportunities. It's clearly not been a what's the phrase here? It's clear there's clearly not bad blood per se, because if it was a bad blood separation, they wouldn't still be working on the World Cup, right? It wouldn't be a case of Cricket West Indies going, well, you know what, Dominic's going to just is now going to do the commercial role for the World Cup, which, to be honest, Santokie, you could argue is bigger than working for Cricket West Indies on a day-to-day, because of the commercial boom that they're projecting to come from the World Cup. I saw something earlier today about 400 million is what they're projecting, or 300 million is what they're projecting will make its way into the region as a result of the World Cup, right? So we can't pretend like Dominic's doing a minor little man job now, having had his contract, or having finished up with his contract for Cricket West Indies. It's a very, very big job. And I'm sure after that job, he will walk into any role he effectively wants within that field, having worked a World Cup, right? Similarly with Spoons, if it was a case of them just saying, well, you know what, you're no good, they wouldn't ask him to then be the media lead for the World Cup. Like you know what I mean? You wouldn't move the man into the World Cup immediately and go, yeah, but please do this job. So it's clearly, for me, not as simplistic as saying, oh, you know, there's some bad blood there and whatever. But I think also, just kind of bringing it back round to the first thing I said when we started the episode, it also, for me, just speaks to Dr. Kishore Shallow, approach to running Cricket West Indies, which is that, as it should have been, as this organisation should have been run from day dot, which is that it's not a friendship thing out here. If I believe that a change has to take place, then a change has to take place after a thorough overhaul and overview of jobs and roles and practices, and I reach a determination that, yeah, you know what, this is now the best thing for the organization, then so be it. And what I would say, Santokie, is more of that, please. More of that. Because my big criticism of, certainly since we started this podcast, my big criticism within Cricket West Indies, and even before we started this podcast, is you could argue that in Cricket West Indies and at the various different territories, in some senses, once you get a job, you've got a job for life. Do you know what I mean? And that kind of attitude and that kind of way of running a business, you can't run like that. Like you've got to have key performance indicators, and if you don't believe someone's up to the mark, I'm not saying that that's the case with Dominic and Philip, but I'm saying if you don't believe someone's up to the mark, then you make the change.
Yeah, I think it's probably speaks to a wider issue in terms of Caribbean sports, because I know, like, in terms of football administration, it's quite similar in terms of a lot of administrations have previously been run as if it was still like the 80s or 90s. But in the past 20 years in sports, we've seen so much money influx come into sports. You can't really operate like that anymore. So I think this is the start of sort of Kishore Shallow moving Cricket West Indies more into the modern world. And in terms of business, in terms of running it like a business, in terms of if you're performing, you'll stay in a job, you'll do well. But we can't keep people based on the fact that they're good people, they're nice friends that we have. We got to, for the sake of West Indies cricket, we need to develop it. And I think we're starting to see the signs of that. And as I said, I expect to see more changes, wholesale changes in terms of restructuring the organisation after the World Cup in June. So, Mash, I think that's probably everything we wanted to touch on in this episode. As always, as we say on this podcast, we're not here just to look at senior men's performances on the field. We look at the youth team, the women's game, the senior men's team, administrative, anything going on in the world of Caribbean cricket. We're going to try our best to cover it on the show and analyze it. So thank you, everyone, for your continued support. Long may it continue into 2024. And Mash, I'll pass over the final words to you.
Yeah, do you know what? People get confused when we do these episodes. You know, when we do an episode where we're not busting jokes, people get mad. People get mad confused because they don't realize that we can do these episodes if we want to. So what I will just say is this, though, Santokie. People.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if people can see it, but the brand new merch for the Caribbean Cricket Podcast ahead of for those going to the World Cup, ahead of the World Cup. I know it's hot in the Caribbean, but certainly ahead of the England tour as well. I don't know how well people can see this. So we got the brand new sweatshirts. Santokie gets one for free and I get one for free, but the rest of you have to pay for them. But if you want one of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast sweatshirts, they're out now, brand new. They've come to the headquarters. If you're a patron, it'll cost you £23. If you're not a patron, that'll cost you £30. There is no extra charge for postage and packaging. I'll sort all that out. If you want one and you're overseas, i.e. not in the UK, there may be a bit more for postage and packaging, depending on what the post office tells me to get one out there. But the print of the logo is sick. It's super sick. Anyone who's ever bought our stuff before will attest that the finished quality is always really good. So if you want a Caribbean Cricket Podcast sweatshirt, hit me up. They're limited edition. It's not. I haven't got an extensive amount of them to sell. So if you first come, first serve. And then finally, we probably will return with an episode looking at the release of the World Cup fixtures. We didn't speak about that in this episode. The release of the World Cup fixtures, obviously quite a bit of debate about that. Looks West Indies are going to Guyana, Trinidad, and what's the other place we're going? Guyana, Trinidad. Was it St. Lucia? Yeah. Do you know what, Santokie? I reckon that was deliberate to play Afghanistan in St. Lucia. It has to be. It has to be. Because I'm telling you, if we played Afghanistan in Guyana and Trinidad, we might be finished out here, you know. So we'll try and look at that in a bit more detail as well in terms of the World Cup schedule, etc. But as ever, as Santokie says, thank you everyone for jumping on, listening in. Look out for some more content. We're going to do something. Keep an eyes open. We may have Barrett Sundaresan coming up on the show very, very soon ahead of the Australia tour. So look out for some content on that regard as well. But as Santokie says, thank you as ever. Like, share, subscribe. We've been the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Thank you and good night.
We rule the cricket world. Now the rule seems coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.